We'll start off with a brief introduction and then we'll get right into it. So with that said, hello everyone, happy International Women's Day. Thank you so much for attending the first of our 2 events today as we celebrate International Women's Day. Today's events are brought to you by GSEP Center for Global Partnerships and Learning. And I, for those of you who don't know, am Dr. Gabriela Miramontes. I am the director of our center, full-time faculty and director of the EIP program. My apologies, I get really nervous when I'm talking. I do know my name, just wanting to be clear. As some of you may know, the Center for Global Partnerships and Learning provides GSEP students with a myriad of services ranging from publication support, certificate programs, access to GSEP's academic journal, and a few other services. Our center also hosts events, info sessions, and workshops on various topics. And in fact, yesterday we had one on ethnographic, quantitative ethnography. Sorry, I knew I was going to get that. Our keynote speaker for International Women's Day is Dr. J. Goosby Smith. Dr. Goosby Smith serves as the university's inaugural Vice President for Community Belonging and Chief Diversity Officer. Guided by God's call to unite God's people, Dr. Goosby Smith approaches her specialty areas of human diversity, inclusion, and belonging with intellectual rigor, methodological soundness, patience, a healing spirit, and a love of humanity and good-natured sense of humor. Before rejoining Pepperdine, where she had previously served as faculty member in Seaver College's Business Administration Division, and as an adjunct member of the Graziadio faculty, Dr. Goosby Smith served as faculty member, assistant provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and director of the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina. She also taught at California State University, Channel Islands, and Butler University. A nationally sought after public speaker, educator, and consultant, Dr. Goosby Smith has worked with a wide range of organizations such as Cleveland Clinic, KeyBank, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She is a member of Mensa America, Jack and Jill of America, and Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, having previously served as inaugural faculty advisor and later graduate advisor for Pepperdine's Tau Lambda, I never pronounced that, Tau Lambda chapter. Dr. Goosby Smith earned a BS in computer science from Spelman College and an MBA and a PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western Reserve University. In the spring of 2022, she's expected to complete her Master's of Divinity from the Interdenominational Theological Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Goosby Smith today and for being a part of our programming.
Well, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I was really looking forward to this talk and time we have together and sharing with you kind of an exploration that I've been on. And so I've been looking at a lot of different events that occur and a lot of different historical events and looking at them through the standpoint of looking at the role of women. And so toward that end, I figured we would talk today, and I'll get my screen shared here. We'll talk today, and our topic will be, initially it was called the 5 kingpins of Martin Luther King, but since it's International Women's Day, it's going to be the 5 queenpins of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King today. And so thank you so much, Dr. Miramontes, for that wonderful introduction. So kind of the flow of what I'll be talking about, we'll talk a little bit about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the March on Washington. And then we'll talk about some organizations you may have never heard of, and we'll talk about different women who really had a key role in making the event occur. So most of us have heard about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's quote, "I have a dream" speech that was given on August 28th of 1963 as part of the March on Washington. And so during my research, I started looking up a lot of the context behind this speech, and it just splintered in a million different directions. Of course, there were 250,000 attendees there. And the background of this actually started 27 years before, when in 1941, A. Philip Randolph of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters planned a huge march in Washington. And he had that march, and he was initially protesting how Black soldiers went off to World War II, but then they came back and they really still faced segregation. However, the day before that march, President Roosevelt met with A. Philip Randolph and kind of convinced him not to have that march. And so next, he signed the Fair Employment Practice Committee Act, which was charged with looking at racial discrimination in the military. So Randolph canceled the march. So in the mid 1940s, though, that act and that committee were canceled. So then again, we see in the late 1950s, A. Philip Randolph was still alive in 1957 when a young Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King comes onto the scene. And he thought that planning a march with King would be good because King is now bringing up civil rights again, seems like it's time. And so they planned to have another march. And initially, it was looking at capitalizing this, and he had a march for the NAACP. It was smaller, and it occurred in 1957. Then again in 1963, there were many violent attacks on demonstrators in Birmingham, and A. Philip Randolph again said, well, let's link up. And so the March on Washington that we're talking about now in 1963 was actually a collaboration between A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King. However, you hear the saying where they say, behind every great man, there's a great woman. Well, this March on Washington, I Have a Dream speech is just the tip of the iceberg. And it's not even behind a great man is a great woman. There were great women that completely undergirded this whole event that this would never have occurred without. And so I figured what better time to talk about those women from a variety of backgrounds that might surprise you to look at how this speech actually came about. So the interesting thing was that President Kennedy on June 22nd of this year, 1963, tried to meet with Reverend Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph to get them not to do the march, similarly to how the march was not done before. And his rationale was that the march would be ill-timed. And so I wanted to share this quote of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King before we get into the women who undergirded it. So when President Kennedy told Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that the march would be ill-timed and that they should cancel it, King said, frankly, I have never engaged in any direct action movement which did not seem ill-timed. And so I thought that that was just such a classy response to basically say, it's never going to be time to try to get your rights. And so JFK reluctantly agreed to the march and asked his brother, Robert Kennedy, to do security. And so next, I want to talk a little bit about some of the people and organizations you might not know. So there are 5, they're called the Big 5 organizations of the Civil Rights Movement. And I wanted to introduce you to each one. And in the process of introducing these organizations to you, let you know the role that women have played. So the first organization that was the earliest is the NAACP, which stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. From what I hear, they've considered changing the name, but everybody knows them as NAACP, so they're probably going to stay as the NAACP. Well, anyway, the NAACP was founded in 1909 in New York City. So it's very much a Northern movement, and it comes out of the Niagara movement, which involved different suffragists who, of course, were advocating for women to have the right to vote, and social workers, journalists, and things like that. Well, one of the facts I found out when I was researching the NAACP is that it was not founded only by Black people, as many of us here. W.E.B. Du Bois founded the NAACP. No, there were 3 of their founders were female, and one of those females was white. And I'll talk about her a little bit more when we get to the picture. So the three females who were part of the founding of the NAACP, along with Archibald Grimke, which is a popular name in funding for civil rights, W.B. Du Bois, Oswald Villiard, William English Walling, and Henry Moskowitz. The three women were Mary White Ovington, looks like Covington, but no C, Mary White Ovington, Ida Barnett Wells, Ida B. Wells, and Mary Church Terrell. And so I didn't know that fact. So the NAACP's vision is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights and there's no racial hatred or racial discrimination. So that's what the NAACP is about. So I never knew that they were founded by three females. The next organization to the right of it, which has the equal sign, is the National Urban League. And so the National Urban League was founded by two people, one of whom was a white female, Ruth Standish Baldwin. And I'll talk a little bit about her in a minute because I'll have all their pictures up on the next slide. And so the purpose of the Urban League, it was originally started as the Committee on Urban Conditions Among Negroes, which was founded in 1906, which merged with the National League for the Protection of Colored Women, 1905. So when those two organizations merged, they became known as the National League on Urban Conditions Among Negroes, which started in 1910. And so Ruth Standish Brown is one of the founders of that organization. And so I'll talk about her a little bit more. The mission for the National Urban League is to enable and empower African Americans and others in underserved communities to achieve their highest human potential and secure economic self-reliance, parity, power, and civil rights. The third organization in the middle, which is called CORE, stands for Congress of Racial Equality. This organization was founded by an interracial group of students in Chicago. So far we have three Northern civil rights organizations, and CORE was designed to advise and support. They did a lot of advising and supporting of Martin Luther King during the Montgomery bus boycott. And King worked with CORE from the late 50s until the mid 1960s. The reason that he stopped working with them was because in the mid to late 60s, they took a more separatist view and they did away with nonviolence. And that was King's primary methodology. Interestingly, CORE did not allow women, and CORE disbanded in the late 60s. So that's our first theme here. The next organization I want to tell you about is SCLC. That is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This organization was founded by all men. Why? Because at the time, most of the men that formed it were Baptist ministers, and Baptists at the time did not ordain women. So this was an all-male organization. And the all-maleness of the organization will come about when I introduce you to Ella Baker, because eventually she got tired of that, but I jump ahead. And the last organization I'll tell you about is SNCC, or SNCC. If you've ever heard of John Lewis was a very prominent member of this organization. He just passed away last year. But SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and it was founded by 4 Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina. Those were the initial members, but the founder is singular. It's Ella Baker. So Ella Baker, you're going to hear a lot about. And part of the reason she started SNCC was because, I'll give you a sneak peek, she was with SCLC. In fact, she was its executive director, but she got tired of the men wanting all the glory. So let's introduce you to these women you've never heard of, and then I'll come back to the I Have a Dream speech. These organizations are so critical because without them, King would have never had the movement that he had that got him to the speech. So when you take a look at these women, the first woman on the left right here, this is Mary White Ovington, and she is one of the founders of the NAACP. She was impressed by hearing Frederick Douglass, and that was what made her join the civil rights movement. She was very active in the American suffragist movement to get women the right to vote. She was a journalist and she was an author. And in 1921, this is how bold Mary White Ovington was. In 1921, she wrote a letter to several suffragists, to a leading suffragist organization, to request that a Black woman be invited to the National Women's Party's celebration of the 19th Amendment. So as many of you know, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, but it didn't give all women the right to vote. And so Mary White Ovington was bold enough that she wrote the major suffragist movement to say, hey, we need to invite Black women into this process. In 1934, she went around speaking to many colleges and many Black colleges to let people know that they had allies. In her language, it was to show them that whites also opposed racial discrimination. So she's one of the founders of the NAACP. She's rolling up her sleeves, trying to make things better in society. The woman to the right of her, some of you may recognize, that's Ida Wells. And she was an early journalist. She lived much earlier than the civil rights movement, but she did a lot of the setup for the suffragist movement. And she was a journalist. She did a lot of writing of opinion pieces. She led an anti-lynching crusade. So this anti-lynching crusade is gonna be very important as we look through history. And we even had some history on this yesterday in 2022, really. And so Ida B. Wells was just a mouthpiece, and she was a journalist, and she did so much. And if I'm remembering correctly, she was born pretty early, I think in the 1860s, and I think she passed like in the 1930s. But when you think about what she accomplished, being born around the time of abolition, she went from that, she went to Fisk University and Rust University. So those are both HBCUs, historically Black colleges or universities. And the reason I mention that is because there were several institutions involved in the civil rights movement. Of course, you had churches, but you also had colleges, you had journalists, you had lawyers. And so it was kind of a model to look at with doing social change. It's multidisciplinary and it's multi-industry and it's multi-sector in society. The woman to the right of her is Mary Church Terrell. So Mary Church Terrell was also born, actually she was born in 1863, the year the Emancipation Proclamation ends up being signed. And she ended up being one of the first Black women to earn a college degree. So you're born during emancipation and you become one of the first Black women to earn a college degree. She taught Latin in the M Street School, the first Black public school, high school in the US. And she was a renowned educator, and she was a national advocate for civil rights and for suffrage, for women's right to vote. And she also appealed to President Harrison to condemn lynching. So these two women, the two middle ones on the top row, both were advocating for condemning lynching in the early 1900s. And yesterday, the Senate voted unanimously to make lynching a hate crime. And so, hundreds of years later, so progress does come, but it sure is slow. The next woman on our list is Ruth Standish Baldwin. She's one of the two founders of the National Urban League. Okay, who knew? And so Ruth has a pretty amazing story. She was born in 1865, died in 1934. She was the wife of a railroad tycoon, and she joined Francis Keller, who was a social worker and attorney, to form the National League for the Protection of Colored Women. That was one of the organizations that merged into the National Urban League. So not only was she a founder of the National Urban League, she was a founder of one of the organizations that merged to find it. And the reason this organization, the National League for the Protection of Colored Women, came about was to protect Southern Black women from prostitution, because they were coming up from the South, didn't know anything. There were a lot of predatory people trying to trick them and schmooze them and all this, kind of like the trafficking today, but it was domestic trafficking. So the organization was founded to help them. So they had social workers, they had advisors. And an interesting thing about her is that she was so committed to steering women to safe employment. So there were a lot of employment counselors as well. And she commissioned the design for the Standish House, and she was a friend of Booker T. Washington's. And so far what you can see are the critical roles that women are playing in the early parts of the civil rights movement, and that it's an integrated group of women. You know, we have our stereotypes and we think that, oh, they were just, you know, Black women doing this, or there were just white women doing suffrage. No, there were Black women like Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell advocating for the suffrage movement. And there were white women like Mary White Covington and Ruth Standish Baldwin advocating for helping Black women as they migrated. So on the bottom row, this is Ella Baker. And Ella Baker is just absolutely dynamic and amazing. So Ella Baker is the founder of SNCC, so the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And she was already serving as the executive director of SCLC. So if you remember SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, that was the one that was founded by the Baptist ministers, that was all men. And they had a lot of women, of course, working, but the men were taking the forefront, you know, Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and all these other names that you've heard, Joseph Lowry, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. So they were the big charismatic preachers and faces of it. And so Ella Baker actually served as the executive director for SCLC. So who's actually running SCLC? It's Ella Baker. And after a while, she left because she felt like the men just wanted all the glory and she had enough of it. So when in Greensboro, North Carolina, they had the sit-ins at the Woolworths counter, which is a historic thing. She said, I want to organize these students, you know, because she started to realize the youth were going to be the way toward progress. And so she contacted the students who did the boycott at Woolworths, and she contacted them and she invited them to Raleigh, North Carolina, because she was at Shaw University. They were at North Carolina A&T, another HBCU, Shaw, another HBCU. So you see more connections. And she helped them to organize. Not only did she help them organize into SNCC, she also, when she was with SCLC, helped King get into Montgomery and help with the bus boycott, which was very, very important. She also worked with SNCC, the student organization, to help them organize Freedom Summer. And so one of the early students that worked with her was Diane Nash. And she was one of the few prominent women who kept participating in the sit-ins. And so Diane Nash and others were early movers in the sit-in movement. SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they also organized the Freedom Summer. So if you think about the Freedom Summer 1961 through 1964, they were sending groups of kids. They were in Oxford, Ohio, was where they were doing a lot of training, and white kids, Black kids, all of them were coming down south to try to help get people the right to register to vote. Okay. And so Freedom Summer, trying to end disenfranchisement. They were sending workers. In 1964, you probably heard about the murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. Another example of an integrated group of people trying to do this. But I had never really heard of, this is Diane Nash. So she's one of the women who participated in the sit-ins. And if you Google it, Robert F. Kennedy, he asked, who in the heck, he didn't say heck, but he said, who in the heck is Diane Nash? Because there was a bus bombing at one point and she was on the bus. She survived, she lives today. But the fact that there was, a woman on the bus, he didn't know about her. This woman you've probably never heard of. Her name is Viola Liuzzo. I know I'm saying her name wrong. Liouzzo. Viola Liuzzo. She was a Detroit mom. She had kids. She was married. However, after Bloody Sunday, which was the failed first march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the attempted march, where you'll see the footage of John Lewis just gets beaten. It's just absolutely horrible. She saw that and she heard Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's plea for action. And what she ended up doing, yes, Viola, Liuzzo is her name. So she ends up hearing in February 1965, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's call. She calls her husband and says she's leaving for Detroit. And she says because the reason she's leaving is because, quote, the struggle was everybody's fight. So she was just planning to go down for the Freedom Summer, help where she could, and then come back to Detroit. Well, when she was driving a group of civil rights activists, she was shuttling them between Montgomery Airport so they could fly in and out and coordinating and doing that. She was fatally shot by members of the Ku Klux Klan. And at least one of whom was shown without a shadow of a doubt to be an undercover informant of the FBI. So that's a whole nother talk that we could go into about the FBI and the CIA and J. Edgar Hoover and all that fun. But she didn't die for nothing. They each got 10 years prison sentences, which is not nearly enough in my opinion, but her death and that conviction was a landmark case because it was the first time in Southern legal history that Klansmen had been arrested for actually committing a crime on a civil rights worker. And it was not accidentally, it didn't accidentally happen that she looked like she was because she's a white female. And the irony of that, when you look at some of the history of the Klan, I actually met a woman when I was in Charleston a few years ago who told me she didn't know the Klan was a bad organization. She thought that it was created to protect white women. And that was part of the propaganda of the founding of the Klan. And I didn't know that, so that was new to me. And so it's very ironic that the case that would eventually end up getting them convicted was because they killed, but didn't protect this courageous white woman who came down from Detroit. So these are some of the women in the civil rights movement, and I'm still digging. There's so many that we just don't hear about. And so I think that those of you who are historians, I'm not, but if you are a historian, these are people whose lives are worth digging into because there were so many. So now I'd say let's turn back to the March on Washington. So you have to know the name Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was from Ruleville, Mississippi, which is in Sunflower County. So that's in the Mississippi Delta. And when she got into her 40s, she found out about the 19th Amendment. And she said, well, then I should be able to vote. So she went to go register to vote. The first thing they did was give her a literacy test. So if you were Black and you tried to vote in the early to mid 1900s, you get this literacy test, which would ask you all these questions that you've really probably never heard of in life. She said that one of the questions that they asked her was to explain de facto law. Well, Fannie Lou Hamer is quoted as later saying, "I know as much about a facto law as a horse knows about Christmas Day." So they had all these impossible questions that no one could answer. And so, of course, she failed the test. And then when she got home, here's the bad part. She was from a sharecropping family. So if you don't know what a sharecropper is, basically regularly had a plantation and you had enslaved people working. So then you have emancipation. So now you still have a plantation, but you have tenant farmers. They're the people who have the land and they hire sharecroppers. So that's what the newly emancipated people, many of them did, including my ancestors in that state of Mississippi, were sharecroppers. And so, but when she got home, her boss was so mad that she went to town to try to register, that he said her whole family worked on this sharecropping endeavor. He said she had to move that night. She had to leave. And he said that it was because Mississippi was not ready for Blacks to vote. So that's why he took her job, took her home. So she's forced to leave this plantation that night, and she stayed with some friends of hers. Well, of course, it's very small news, and in retaliation, the Ku Klux Klan did a drive-by, fired at her 16 times. They didn't hit her, but she didn't stop. She went back to Indianola, Mississippi to try to take the literacy test again. She failed again, and she told them, quote, "You will see me every 30 days until I pass." So she had a ridiculous amount of persistence. So finally, it's January of 1963. She takes the test and she passes. However, when she showed up that fall to vote, they had a poll tax. And they said, well, where is your receipt for paying the poll tax? So if you're Black, you had to pass a literacy test, then you had to pay this poll tax. And so she found the money, she paid the poll tax, she had the receipt. But in 1963, before she got to vote, she and others were stopping at a break in Winona, Mississippi, just to break your travel and you're tired. And the people at the cafe refused them service, called the police. The police took her to jail and they beat her. They damaged a kidney. She said they put her dress over her head. It's a very just gut-wrenching statement, even to hear now, of the violation that she experienced. And she said they beat her with a blackjack. So to me, it looked like I looked up blackjack, looked like a billy club type of thing. And to make a long story short, as she recalled the story, she worked with SNCC during Freedom Summer. So now she comes into working with SNCC. So you remember Ella Baker founded the organization, got Diane Nash, who was a freedom writer. So now Fannie Lou Hamer starts working with SNCC. And that was also who brought down Schwerner and Cheney and Goodman, and who were abducted and murdered. Well, anyway, since she can't vote, really, she co-founds the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And they wanted to be seated at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. And so at that convention, she shared the story of, being beaten and trying to vote, and in very vivid detail that I did not share, the violations and how the police just really abused her. President Lyndon Johnson was so adamant about the world not hearing Fannie Lou Hamer's story that he scheduled a bogus press conference, State of the Union, right at that moment. And reportedly, he's just talking about the 9-month anniversary of something until she's done. So somebody tells him she's done. And so then he abruptly ends this press conference that was about nothing. Well, of course, the footage of the press conference leaked out. And when Americans heard the abuse that she had endured just trying to vote, that June, President Johnson ends up signing into law the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. So what he tried to silence her voice ends up getting out. There's actually coverage of Walter Cronkite covering it. And if you go to YouTube, you'll hear her talk. She had a powerful singing voice. She had a powerful speaking voice. She's very much a Southern woman of her time from Mississippi. She sounded a lot like ancestors and family members that I know, but so powerful and just such persistence. And so as a result of that pressure, then Johnson in 1965 signs the Voting Rights Act. So you've got the suffragists that are going with women's right to vote. And then you have others like Fannie Lou Hamer who are advocating, and SNCC who are doing the Freedom Riders. That was all about getting people to vote. The reason voting was so important was because if you can vote, you can put legislators in office who can maybe vote for your interests. And we saw right after the end of slavery, we saw during Reconstruction how many senators and congressmen were elected from different states. And so Andrew Young did her eulogy in 1977, and he spoke and he said, none of us would be where we are now had she not been there then. So Fannie Lou Hamer is definitely a mother of the civil rights movement. Oops, excuse me. The next one I want to talk with you about, because I'm only talking about women today. The next one I wanted to talk with you about is Prathia Hall Nguyen. So she's a youngster. She's born in 1940. So she's only 23 around the time of the March on Washington, but she's born to a Baptist preacher, and she became a preacher herself, as you could see. Well, she became a speaker. She wasn't a preacher, she was a speaker. And she's the youngest person to impact the March on Washington. So in 1963, there were some 1962 or 63, there were a lot of bombings in Birmingham. They started calling it Bombingham, you know. And so there was a church that had been bombed, but before that, she went to Temple. So she went to Temple University. And when she was there in college, she participated in sit-ins. She was jailed and held without bail for 2 weeks. So they just held her. Well, in 1962, the year before the March on Washington speech, she joined SNCC. So the SNCC organization was so important because it was created for students. Students pretty much were the energy of that movement. And on September 9th of 1962, about a year before the March on Washington, some churches in Georgia had been bombed. Mount Olive Baptist Church near Sasser, Georgia, and Mount Mary Baptist Church near Chickasawachi, Georgia, were burned. And they were holding a prayer vigil. And these churches being burned, they invited Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King down, you know, to kind of talk with people, you know, keep them going, inspire them. Well, Prathia Hall led the group in a prayer vigil. And in that prayer vigil, she kept repeating, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. And so as she repeated that, King heard this oratorical element, and he asked her, could he start using it in her sermons? And she later acknowledged that yes, he asked her permission to use the phrase in his future sermons. So if he was preaching, occasionally he'd use that rhetorical instrument of I have a dream, blah, 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 I have a dream, blah, 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 blah. So Prathia Hall later earned a Master of Divinity, a Master of Theology, and a PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. And in 2000, she joined the faculty of Boston University, but she died in 2002 of cancer at the age of 62. But this is a person you haven't heard, because the reason that the I have a dream element is even in that speech is because Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King heard this 22, 23-year-old preaching and praying. So, I was like, wow, really? You gotta be kidding me. So next and final woman I want to tell you about today is Mahalia Jackson. And so Mahalia Jackson, she was born in 1911, died in 1972, but she was like a gospel singer of gospel singers. Her voice, you can listen to her voice and close your eyes and you literally go somewhere into the South. She just had the ultimate gospel voice, and she was a very well-known star. She was on a lot of TV shows, and she was one of the people who just kind of refused to not sing gospel, because a lot of people went between gospel and, blues, or gospel and R&B, and she stayed with gospel. And so the reason that Mahalia Jackson is so important to this picture is because she was at the March on Washington, and she sang right before Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King took the stage. In fact, if you come to Malibu, this is my shameless plug, come to Malibu before March 27th and see the Kinsey exhibit, you will see an exhibit of a picture of the actual program from the March on Washington, that the Kinsey exhibit. And you can see that Mahalia Jackson was on the program just before Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So what does this have to do with the March on Washington? So she sings her gospel song, and then Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King comes up and he's giving his speech, and it's going well. And then on some of the recordings, and also the speechwriter said the I Have a Dream part was never in the speech, because he had taken notes for the speech and there was a manuscript. The I Have a Dream part was never in the speech. It was never on the original manuscript. And in some of the recordings of the March on Washington of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's speech, in the middle of his speech towards the end, it's Mahalia Jackson's voice who screams out, "Tell him about the dream, Martin, tell him about the dream." So that's why he launches into the I Have a Dream speech. And so when she says that, he looks to his left and he folds over his manuscript, and then he just goes. So when you look at that speech, which is so magical that all of us know is the I Have a Dream speech, which was actually complete improvisation, because Mahalia Jackson screams out for him to tell him about the dream, Martin. He even has an I Have a Dream speech because Prathia Hall he's heard her pray this, and this is her oratorical instrument. He ends up even being involved in the voting rights and the freedom fighters because of Fannie Lou Hamer and others who were advocating for the right to vote, who were setting up these organizations, who were founding the NAACP with whom he worked, who were founding the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was his organization. They had founded the Urban League. They had founded the Congress of Racial Equality, and they had founded SNCC. All of the work of these women are why the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King got done. And so I kind of looked at this and I said, wow, the other thing that amazed me was that when Martin Luther King, you might see Michael King, but I'll tell you about that in a second. When he was in seminary, he got a C in public speaking. Excuse me, typo there. He got a C in public speaking. And so I said, Michael King, because he was born Michael King. So his father was Michael King Sr., who we know as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. When he was 5, his name was changed from Michael King to Martin Luther King because his father, who most Black people refer to as Daddy King, got exposed to Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation, and he changed his name to Martin Luther, and he changed Martin Luther's name to Martin Luther King. And so this is just a little bit of the result of the research that I've been doing into the women that completely undergirded the civil rights movement and all the things that led up to this speech for the March on Washington. So this has been fun to prepare, and I guess that's the end of my formal remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Goosby Smith. Would anyone have any questions for her regarding the topic? Is there any commentary that anyone would like to share? So there's a few comments in the chat talking about how inspiring and the power of women's voices and how fascinating this content all is. Absolutely. And as we think about International Women's Day, you know, these questions started coming up recently about the work we're doing here in the United States and the ripple effects it tends to have, especially now with the advent of social media. Just how we tend to be pretty vocal as women here in the States. for better or worse. And I think oftentimes that leads to not the courage, because I think as women, we're courageous, and it's cultural. So I'm getting to my question, Dr. Goosby Smith, I swear. So this idea of women and the power behind women and what we bring to the table. Culturally, in many cultures, we're raised to be seen and not heard. So, and I think that's the system of oppression, and we can either choose to live into it or choose not to. The theme that I'm hearing behind these women is they were in an oppressive society. They were under a very oppressive circumstances, and they chose to let their voices be heard.
I think also there was wide diversity in how they let their voices be heard. So if we were to look at Ida B. Wells, she let her voice be heard by writing. If you were to look at Violet Liuzzo, the white woman who came down from Detroit, she let her voice be heard by just trying to go down. She was just driving people from the airport to the places where they were meeting. That's how she let her voice be heard. When you look at Mary White Ovington, who was one of the founders of the NAACP, and also Mary Church Terrell, they let their voices be heard by founding organizations. And so they were facing the oppression of being in just a shamelessly sexist society that was not meant for them. And also half the women were also facing racism, oppressive racism, in which you weren't even considered to be human. And so the voices came in many, many, many different ways. Mahalia Jackson wasn't known as a civil rights activist, but she screams, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." So there are so many ways to have voices, and there are so many different cultures. And it may be that the voice that a person has is to educate her children well on their history. So voice takes many forms. It's not always like a Fannie Lou Hamer or a Prathia Hall who will actually grab the microphone and speak. But I do think that it takes a diverse group of women in terms of careers, in terms of ages, in terms of backgrounds, races, ethnicities, to actually move things forward. And the other thing is that if you look at the state of women in a society, you'll see the state of the society. When we do well, society does well. And when we suffer, society suffers. So I think there's a lot of ways to have voice.
Absolutely. There's a question in the chat from Charlotta Green. She's asking, in your research on Mary Church Terrell, did you find the connection between her father and Greenwood community in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
I didn't find that yet, but again, like I said, I'm not a historian. I just started looking, and one thing led to another, and I started realizing, oh, really? Ella Baker founded SNCC? Oh, I always associated SNCC with John Lewis. Oh, SCLC, that's only Black male preachers. Oh, Ella Baker was the director. So I'm just starting to pull the strings, but that doesn't surprise me at all, because Greenwood, was that where Black Wall Street was?
Yeah, he was one of the people that helped to fund folks that moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I was just thinking about the ways in which some families shaped and molded the trajectory of the women that step out, by not standing in the way, by not relegating them to these traditional roles. So she learned about money and owning property and organizing because of who her father was. And I think that that's also important about what shapes women. Oftentimes we talk only about the oppressive nature of the shaping, but sometimes there's just some pretty powerful shaping and some powerful family dynamics that propel women.
I think that's spot on, because Prathia Hall was the daughter of a preacher. Mahalia Jackson, I can't remember her history, but you also have, you look at modern day of what Bernice King is doing right now. And you look at that footprint and, you know, the role that dad plays is huge. Also, we just got back on Thursday from a civil rights tour course that I and Dr. Ben Postlethwaite of Seaver College's business division took 20 Seaver Pepperdine students on. And we talked with, in person, we met James Chaney's daughter, who her dad had been killed in the movement. And we met her at her dad's grave. And she was only 10 days when he got killed. And she talked about what she knew of him for justice and how that impacted her. And we also met Rena Evers, who is the daughter of Medgar Evers. And we got to study there. And so that sounds like an interesting dissertation topic, the role that parents play, the role that dads play in impacting their kids, and also the roles that mothers play. Because they were asking Bernice King, I was listening to an interview, and they said, you know, we know that your dad has impacted you, you know, quite a bit. She looks just like him. She and Dexter, of the 4 kids, look just like him. 2 look like Coretta Scott King, 2 look like Martin King. And they're asking her, well, what impact did your mother have? And she said, you know, basically, you know, that her mother taught her to, you know, to always try to be kind and always try to be nice, to kind of to balance out. But that's an excellent point. And also to your point about the connection with Black Wall Street between Mary Church, Terrell, all of the people who seemed to be in various facets of this movement, because the civil rights movement, it had financial aspects, it had legal aspects. I was totally surprised to find out, you know, we know Thurgood Marshall for Brown versus Board of Education. Well, that wasn't one case. That was just the first case, because they had organized legally to go across the different states filing discrimination suits that separate was not equal. And if you look at the paper for the Brown versus Board of Education, it's like Brown versus Board of Education, this person versus this. So it's a compendium of cases that went to the Supreme Court, and they had gotten methodically all these state precedents to do it. And so all of them seemed to be, and I think that's what's missing today, whether it's women's rights or women in different cultures, the strategic aspect of using all the resources you have. I see Maria. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for this talk. I just want to, I was moved to sort of elevate the name of one of our own Pepperdine alumni. You might actually know her now. She graduated back in the 1970s, one of the original. Her name is Katherine Meeks. And she wrote—
Yes, I've met Katherine Meeks.
You have, yeah. Oh, I'm so glad. I had a feeling maybe you would. Yeah. She wrote a book about Ida B. Wells, Passionate for Justice, which is really fascinating and fantastic. And yeah, she's another voice that's really important and out there and raising issues. And she runs the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing, excuse me, on the East Coast. And so I thought it was worth mentioning her. She also met Ida, actually.
Wow.
You probably know that, but yeah.
No, I don't know that. I've only come to know her in her advocacy for keeping the legacy of Larry Donnell Kimmons alive.
Right.
So that's how I came to meet her. And I actually might be on a call with her this Friday.
Oh,
so now I have to ask her about the Ida B. Wells book.
Oh, it's terrific. And of course, I'm the librarian for GSEP, by the way. And so of course we have that book in the library.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, lovely to meet you as well. Yeah, we brought her for a talk last year about this book that's fairly recently published. So yeah, oh my goodness, give her the library's warm wishes. We
absolutely
appreciate her so much.
Yes, and yes, I see the comment about Mary McLeod Bethune and Bethune-Cookman in Daytona Beach, Florida. Absolutely. And there are so many women that did so many things, but what started me pulling the strings of the yarn was looking at this I Have a Dream speech. And every time I just pulled, something led to something else, and it just blew me away. And it has to do with getting to know our librarians and doing our own research and being information literate and not hearing what people tell us, but also doing our own research, because every time you do your own research, I've been just blown away. So now I'm just, and this is for fun. I'm not writing in this particular area. So, but it's amazing.
There's another question. There's a couple. So Dr. Eric Hamilton is asking, my guess is that women have had an invisible but central role in the formation of many HBCUs, despite foundings being attributed exclusively to males in most cases. Can you comment on the role of women in HBCUs?
I can only comment on the woman at my HBCU, which is Spelman College. And so Spelman had initially came about, Spelman is the maiden name of Laura Spelman Rockefeller, who was married to James D. Rockefeller. And so that's what's called Spelman College, is her maiden name. And originally it was founded as a Baptist college, and its motto is still Our Whole School for Christ. And many of the presidents, I think the first presidents were white female, then they had white males, then they had Black males. And the first female president at Spelman was Janetta Besh Cole. However, looking at, what actually drove the college and who actually made the decisions, I remember Christine King Ferris, C.K. Ferris, Dr. C.K. Ferris, excuse me. She was a professor at Spelman who I met during my freshman year. And you have a lot of womanist writings coming out of Spelman. Beverly Guy Sheftall, she was there when I was there. And so much of the work, much of the mentoring has been done, but I have not yet looked at HBCU's foundings, but I would not be surprised to find the same thing, because we are always there. We're always there, and we're always chugging. So that's a really cool question.
And that's why I put Mary McLeod Bethune in the
Yeah.
chat, because she is one that we
Started
do
her
know
own.
of and started her own school.
Yep, she started her own school. And I don't know if there have been others that, there probably have been, but she's the only one that I know started her school. Was it originally for teachers?
It was originally for girls, and definitely for strive. Well, she was an educator and philanthropist, so she was striving to find ways to educate women to do the things that they needed to do. But she started a school really saving change.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard of Bethune-Cookman. I know a couple people who graduated from there last year.
We have one more question, and this is from Dr. Ebony Kane. She's asking, can you speak to what it's like doing this type of research against the backdrop of recent reactions to CRT and other views of history that are critical of prominent historical figures? For example, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Well, if you really look at Lyndon B. Johnson, he was part of the Democratic Party, but initially most American Blacks voted Republican because that was the party of Lincoln. And, Johnson was with the Dixiecrats, which were known for just being really, really something else. And, not to burst bubbles, but there were things that Kennedy said that were kind of, because one of the things he said with trying to get Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Reverend A. Philip Randolph to cancel this March on Washington. He said, well, we don't want to just have a big show. We want to move Congress, because it was move Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act. And so I really don't get too stuck up in the labels, because many of the people who are arguing about critical race theory are as ignorant about what it really is as I am, because it's a specific topic that's taught in law schools. What I'm focused on is really looking at things that are, when I do try to do some little research, I'm a novice, but I do research as a scholar, I'm looking at the truth. And the truth is the truth. What happened, happened. There are recordings, there are birth certificates, death certificates. And so I really am not trying to discredit or credit anybody. I tend to not use a lot of hashtags because the hashtags change, but it's so funny to me that people are boycotting what they're calling critical race theory, when many times it's just boycotting, not wanting to hear some of the other facets of history. History is never completely objective. It is his story. That is who wrote most of the history. And so many people have had many different experiences, and I think it's better to focus on, well, what really, really happened? And so looking at these things is more just kind of looking at, for me, what really happened between the March on Washington. So I'm not trying to make a statement, but yeah, most of us can't even explain what critical race theory is, because unless you've gone to law school and taken those courses, and in the research, there's no clear definition. So I don't really, that doesn't really bother me. I'm just digging, trying to find out what really, really happened and look at the fullness of characters. Like no one person was just the person who was inaugurated with Jackie Onassis and Kennedy in the pink dress with the blood. That's not the only image of Lyndon Johnson. He was very much a Dixiecrat. But
thank you. That's very,
good.
very helpful. And I think it's what's really powerful about your speech as a whole is complicating these narratives and filling in the silences is also giving, I'll just speak for myself as a listener, opportunities to see myself in the work, the work that happened and the work that still needs to happen. So thank you for that. I think that's very incredibly powerful.
I love the way you said that, filling in the silences. Like there had to be, there had to be somebody else doing all these things. There had to be the conversation, the meeting before the meeting, To that point also, I think that the more we fill in the silences and show the different roles that people did to contribute, to the extent that people can see themselves, then they become inspired to do something. So like if you're a writer, be an Ida B. Wells and write about what's happening. If you're a talker, be a Fannie Lou Hamer. If you're a driver, be a Violet Leozu. If you're, there's so many roles to play. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions at this time? I know we're a few minutes over, so I want to be respectful of time. But if there aren't, then I'd like to sincerely thank you for doing this and for being here today, Dr. Goosby Smith. It was an honor having you. As always, I learned so much from these events. I learned so much from the questions. And, it opens up even more questions. So hopefully we can bring you back and have other conversations around this topic. But thank you very much for giving us an hour of your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for giving me an excuse to nerd out. Now I want to go finish this and then look at the Black Wall Street and start pulling those strings. Yeah, anyway, more time.
And then we'll have you come back and we'll have a discussion about that as well.
Or one of you all will pull those strings and I'll come listen.
Absolutely. And with that, thank you all for coming, as always, to our event today. We have another event later this afternoon. We also posted a survey on the chat, so if you could take a minute and just give us a little bit of feedback, we'd really appreciate it. That helps us in our programming and how we offer these events in the future. But thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope to see you in a few hours again for our panel discussion. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.